All right, welcome back to another episode of the Psychopedia podcast. I'm your host, Investigator Slater, and I am fresh off of a near-death experience that I had this past Sunday, which was 3 days ago. I started to just vomit. I'm sorry if that's gross to hear. I'm sorry if you're eating. I started vomiting on Sunday, and then I didn't stop vomiting for 27 straight hours until I wound up in the hospital getting IV treatment. So it's been a rough couple of days. This here and now in the studio is literally my first time sitting upright for more than 15, 20 minutes since Sunday. But this is the best place for me to recover because this is my happy place. And there was absolutely no way that I was going to not deliver this episode to you guys. There's no way. I know obviously things happen in podcasters' lives. Sometimes they have to skip a week, whatever. Out of the question for me. So I'm here because I love this and I love you, and we're going to get through this together. And if I have to take some sips of my water to stay hydrated, so be it. So listen, last week we did part 1 of Joel Rifkin, aka Joel the Ripper, aka the original Long Island serial killer. So I get into the studio today, and Matt, who owns the studio where I record, and he's also the sound engineer for Psychopedia, worked on a documentary for A&E called Cold Case Files, The Rifkin Murders. And he was talking to me about this, Matt, a month ago maybe? I feel like he planted the seed and it grew and it sprouted into this horrible poisonous flower in the shape of a Joel Rifkin 2-parter. And that is actually how it landed on my radar and why I wanted to cover it. But I don't think I even realized when I started doing the research that we talked about this a month ago. And it's amazing. So Matt has really cool stories because he was working on the ground here with this documentary. So there's, the investigation is discussed in the documentary, interviews with him. One last thing I will say on that note is I just was talking to Matt about the possibility of me possibly interviewing Joel the Ripper. He's in New York. He's not exactly around the corner. He's all the way upstate. But I would make it happen if he'd be willing to sit down and speak because I would love to pick his depraved brain. I don't want to give him any clout, though. This motherfucker loves attention. That's the thing with him. He loves being interviewed. He loves the attention, which you're going to hear more about here in part 2. So I don't want to feed into that, but I am absolutely fascinated and always prefer having boots on the ground when I'm collecting research. I might do it. If I do, obviously, you guys will be in the know and I will keep you posted. The next item on my list here to discuss is Girl on Gore, which is my second podcast, which lives in the Psychopedia feed, and it's coming out this Monday, July 28th. Definitely subscribe to Psychopedia because that's how you're going to get notifications and alerts, obviously for Psychopedia, but now also for Girl on Gore. And Girl on Gore, guys, is a place where my alter ego goes batshit insane. And I want you on that journey with me. It is not so true crime is what I'm calling it. There's loads of true crime elements and factual pieces of information, but the storyline itself is just from the deepest, darkest corners of my fucked up brain. And I want you to come play with me there. So check it out. Drops this Monday. Or if you want early access now, to the first 2 episodes. And if you want early access on every single episode moving forward, go over to patreon.com/psychopediapod because 2 episodes are living over there already. So you can get a head start. Moving forward, you can get it before the public gets it, a full week. So you can get the heat early. I definitely recommend doing that. Plus Patreon offers so many other things. We have Slaterpedia, which is a full, true crime case every single month. We have private chats. We have Be My Guest, which is literally you, yes, you on the other side of this microphone, guest co-hosting a Patreon episode with me if you'd like. And the most important thing, I think, the biggest Patreon perk is that we offer all Psychopedia episodes ad-free, and it drops the same day that it releases publicly, so there's no delay. It's a good time, so check it out. With that said, I want to give some new patrons a shout out. I like to do that because these guys are paying members, and that really means a lot to me. That support is extremely helpful. It just allows me to keep creating and to keep doing what I hope you're enjoying, what I'm certainly enjoying. Okay, we have Jonathan Goosen, love. I don't know if that's your real name, but I love it because it reminds me of Ryan Gosling, and that's a whole thing here at Psychopedia, the goose, whatever. We have this one I like, the Glove Fit 534. I feel like you want me to cover O.J. Simpson, and I feel like that's your little nod for me to do that. Heard. We have John Lagana. Hey, John. Kenzie Jones, which sounds like, I don't know, a stage name. Like, it's so cute. Okay, this one. Dill the Yowie Hunter? I don't know, Dill. I'm going to need you to clarify what the fuck that is, but it's cute and I like it. And the last one is Sal-E. So I'm going to say, what's up, Sally? I want to thank you all and everyone else who's on Patreon and everybody who's listening right now. Thank you. Thank you for being here on the main feed with me. I appreciate your support, your ears, your feedback, your comments, your subscriptions, all of that. I don't want to keep you from hearing part 2 now of Joel Rifkin because it gets real dark real quick. But before we do that, I want to give you a summary of part 1. This is not to replace, though, part 1. This is what I always say when we do two-parters. You really need to go listen to part 1 if you haven't, because it's in depth, whereas right now I'm giving you a paragraph summary, right? But here is the summary of Joel Rifkin, a.k.a. Joel the Ripper, part 1. So he was a Long Island native who targeted the quote-unquote forgotten women of New York, right? Those who had slipped through society's cracks. He was adopted as an infant by well-meaning parents. He grew up, however, tormented by relentless bullying and social isolation. And so he retreated into these violent, sadistic fantasies as a warped escape from his own inner torment. As an adult, following his father's suicide, Joel began to rapidly descend into darkness as he's made his twisted fantasies into a reality. So he began luring sex workers into his car, where he'd engage in sex or attempt to, before bringing them back to the home that he shared with his mother and strangling them. In some cases, he dismembered their bodies and scattered them across Long Island, the 5 boroughs, in one instance, New Jersey. Other times, he buried them or left them in remote areas. He actually only buried one victim. The rest he disposed of in bodies of water, except for one, which we're going to get to at the very, very end. He meticulously studied other serial killers like Gary Ridgway and Ted Bundy, and then he mimicked their styles and methods of body disposal. In part 1, we also explored how Joel's unyielding desire or need for control and how his need to dominate and silence his victims was absolutely central to his horrific crimes. And of course, we detailed Joel's first 3 murders, which were of Heidi Balch, aka Susie, Julie Blackbird, and Barbara Jacobs. So that is a summary, but we talked about a lot of other stuff in part 1. Like really, I think I talked some psychology and some criminology theory, so go back and listen. But now everything from this point forward constitutes part 2. So here we go. Joel Rifkin's 4th victim was 22-year-old Mary Ellen DeLuca, a sex worker addicted to crack who disappeared on September 1st, 1991 on Jamaica Avenue in Queens. Jamaica Avenue, by the way, is a major east-west artery that cuts through Brooklyn and Queens. And it winds through like neighborhoods and shopping centers, and there's lots of mom and pop stores and fast food joints. And it also intersects with several other key streets as well. So it's really one of the city's busiest and most trafficked stretches. So after Joel picked Mary Ellen up off Jamaica Avenue, they spent the night, a total of 10 hours, according to Joel, drifting through the city's underworld, burning through $150 worth of crack before finally checking into a cheap motel in a strip mall on Long Island, a few miles away from his mom's home in East Meadow. And this was the first time that Joel didn't bring a victim back to his house. At first, Mary Ellen had no interest in having transactional sex. She was there to chase drugs, to chase numbness, to chase the nothingness that she'd grown used to, which is obviously very sad. Eventually, however, Mary Ellen did agree to have sex with Joel, though muttered complaints throughout the entire encounter and constantly asked Joel if he was done yet, her voice just dripping with noticeable disdain. The irritation in her voice, the lack of interest that she had in him, enraged Joel, and his anger flared with each word that she spoke, each rejection. Her desire to return to getting high rather than continuing to have sex with him sent him absolutely spiraling. Then, Mary Ellen said something very shocking even to Joel, words, sadly, that would seal her fate. In a voice heavy with defeat, Mary Ellen confessed during sex how much she hated her life, how much she wished it would just end. And Joel asked with curious calmness if she was serious about wanting to actually die. And when Mary Ellen said yes, Joel acted without hesitation and wrapped his hands around her throat. There was no struggle, no scream, no fight for air, just quiet surrender. Later, Joel would describe the murder of Mary Ellen as, quote, one of the weird ones. If we believe Joel's account of events here, it would seem that Mary Ellen DeLuca essentially died by suicide via homicide, which is really somehow extra tragic. As the sun rose, Joel knew that he needed a plan for disposing of Mary Ellen's body. Remembering how a steamer trunk had been used to store a body in Alfred Hitchcock's movie Frenzy, which was crucial in his life, we talked about that in part 1, Joel purchased one at a nearby Kmart and folded Mary Ellen's body inside of the trunk. He then loaded the trunk into his car and drove north to Orange County, which is not far from West Point. After discovering a picnic area, Joel pulled off to the side of the road near a hot dog truck and removed Mary Ellen's body from the trunk. Because why? He actually wanted to reuse the trunk. Then he left her body, which only had on a bra, on the side of the road where she sat untouched for weeks until October 1st, when she was ultimately discovered. Poor Mary Ellen decomposed so badly that identification was impossible, so much so that cause of death couldn't even be determined. Thus, Mary Ellen DeLuca was buried as a Jane Doe, nameless, faceless, forgotten, just like the others before her. It would take nearly 2 years and Joel's eventual confession for the truth to come to light. Just a few weeks later, marking a shorter cooling-off period, mind you, which we know is very typical for escalating serial killers, Joel targeted his next victim, 31-year-old Yoon Lee, a Korean sex worker he'd actually hired on multiple occasions before that night. And the interaction seemed unremarkable at first, just transactional sex in his car. However, the situation took a sudden turn when which of the following things occurred? Pop quiz. A, Yoon Lee laughed at Joel. B, Joel was unable to maintain an erection. C, the flickering of an overhead streetlight caused Joel to have a seizure. Okay, 5 seconds, guys, go. The answer is B. Joel was unable to maintain an erection. You see, apparently Joel had been with another sex worker earlier that evening and was now struggling to perform with Yoon Lee. In fact, some nights Joel would engage with as many as 5 sex workers. But that night, his pathetic flaccid penis triggered an uncontrollable rage, causing him to grab Yoon Lee by her throat and strangle her. Because in his warped little incel brain, it was Yoon Lee's fault that he couldn't get it up. Later that evening, Joel, can't get it up, kin, the bonerless avenger, I had to, guys, placed her remains in the steamer trunk before disposing of her in the East River. According to Joel, this was the only murder he claimed to genuinely regret because, unlike the others, he actually liked Yoon Lee, which, like, I'm calling complete bullshit on. Joel Rifkin at this point had long since bulldozed over his capacity for remorse, and regret doesn't suddenly sprout, you know? If anything, this was just his twisted attempt at seeming human. Or maybe what he regretted was that he wouldn't be able to enlist her services anymore, you know? Because trust me, we are about to get way deeper into why the word remorse does not belong anywhere near soft-serve Joel. On December 23rd, 1991, Yoon Lee's decomposed body was discovered between East 123rd Street in Manhattan and Randall's Island, which timing-wise was actually just days before Mary Ellen's body would be found in a trunk at a rest stop. However, this time, the body of Yoon Lee was actually identified as her ex-husband came forward to ID her. Randall's Island, for those who may not know, is this little patch of land floating in the East River between Manhattan, the Bronx, and Queens. And I see Matt, laughing a little, I guess because you know Randall's Island, really well, probably.
I mean, yeah, I've played soccer there. It's not floating, it's an island.
Well, yeah, islands float. It's land. I said it's land floating. It's an island, guys. It's an island, or you can say it's land floating. I think either works. Potato, potato. I actually went to a concert there forever ago to see 311, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and the band Garbage, which I'm sure you remember them. And it was actually one of the worst nights of my entire life. Think Fire Festival vibes. Not that bad, but like close. So firefighter Dave and I got stranded there. The porta potties were actual portals to hell. And I ended up having to pee in a plastic cup, which spilled all over me after some drunk asshole slammed into me. So I had to marinate in my own piss for hours while we navigated a ferry, a bus, and finally a cab just to get back to our apartment. Anyway, after Yoon Lee's murder, Joel began killing with terrifying, casual ease. A few days before Christmas in 1991, Joel picked up his sixth victim on West 46th Street in Manhattan. He never got her name, or maybe he just didn't care enough to remember it. To this day, and this is so sad, she is still only referred to as number 6, which is heartbreaking. While this human being, known only as number 6, performed oral sex on Joel in his car, he suddenly reached down and crushed her windpipe. Quick and easy, just another body. Then he drove her corpse back to Long Island and hid it beneath a tarp at the site of his failing landscaping business. Later, he returned with a 55-gallon oil drum stolen from a recycling plant in Westbury on Long Island, where he'd once worked. Joel shoved this woman's body inside of the oil drum like industrial waste before dragging the drum through the South Bronx. Once he reached the water's edge, Joel tipped the drum into the East River. And sadly, that was that. Kind of. Because when Joel turned around after chucking the oil drum, which had this human being inside of it, into the water, he found himself looking directly into the faces of 2 police officers who had been alerted to his presence by an anonymous 911 call. And this was the first and only time that Joel Rifkin had almost gotten caught. The patrolmen just thought that they were potentially busting someone for illegal dumping, not of a human body, but like of waste and stuff like that. But Joel managed to convince the officers that he'd just been out scavenging for scrap metal, like all smiles and complete calmness. It was a simple story, convincing, harmless, and delivered with the eerie calm that we have seen in so many serial killers before. Remember Jerry Brudos, the shoe fetish slayer? We covered him in episode 19. We called that episode High Heel Homicide. He literally ate burgers with his children and his mother while a dead woman whom he killed lay beneath them in the basement, her foot amputated and stored in his secret freezer so he could play with it later. Because killers on this level, cold, calculated, and chillingly normal in their outward behavior, are masters of blending into society while hiding their true darkness behind a carefully constructed mask. It's duality in its finest. And by finest, I mean a level of depravity so well disguised it passes for your neighbor borrowing sugar. So the cops issued Joel a quick warning, and then they let him drive away. Pop quiz. Which serial killer with a flashy pseudonym was spotted by police just blocks from a murder scene while the body was still warm, but was also let go like Joel was? A, the Zodiac Killer. B, the Alphabet Killer. C, the Lipstick Killer. The answer is A, the Zodiac Killer. So we haven't covered the Zodiac Killer yet on Psychopedia, but basically 3 teenagers who witnessed the killer committing a crime called the San Francisco Police Department and described the suspect as a husky white man in a dark or black jacket. However, the dispatcher mistakenly reported the suspect as black. 2 minutes later, 2 nearby officers responded and encountered a white man in dark clothing walking toward the Presidio Army base and unaware that he was the killer, so they didn't arrest him. So basically somebody said, there's a husky white man in a black jacket, and the dispatcher said, you're looking for a black suspect. So when officers literally interviewed who they now believe to be the Zodiac Killer, they simply let him go because they thought they were looking for a black suspect. Wild. By the end of 1991, Joel Rifkin had killed 6 women and remained completely invisible to law enforcement. So, naturally, he kept going. His next victim was 28-year-old Lorraine Orvieto. Once a high school cheerleader from a well-off Long Island family, Lorraine spiraled into addiction to cocaine and battled manic depression, having even spent some time at the nearby Kings Park Psychiatric Center, which I actually used to drive past every time I hung out with my high school boyfriend, who was from Kings Park. By the end of 1991, Lorraine was struggling to survive through sex work, her nights spent in the shadows of the same suburbs where she'd once cheered under Friday night lights. On December 26th, Joel spotted Lorraine in a town on the south shore of Long Island called Bayshore. There used to be a methadone clinic there, so that's possibly why she was there. I'm not sure if that clinic is still there today, but it was there back then. So Joel picked her up and drove her to a quiet spot near a rusted fence that lined a schoolyard. And while Lorraine was performing oral sex on Joel, he wrapped his hands around her throat and he killed her. Then he took Lorraine's AZT pills from her purse, pills that she'd been using to manage her HIV, and kept them as a souvenir, tokens of control and symbols of dominance over a woman forever silenced. In case you're wondering, at this point, after hearing that, Joel did in fact contract several STIs and tested positive for hepatitis and other blood disorders. He developed nickel and dime-sized lesions on the back of his throat, which caused 104-degree fevers and drooling, a sign, I believe, of oral herpes, which is not shocking at all. However, Joel never worried about contracting HIV, as he was under the delusion that the only way to get it was by being on the receiving end of unprotected anal sex. And also, it's worth mentioning that despite contracting painful, symptomatic sexually transmitted infections and diseases, it did not slow his role in the slightest in terms of engaging with sex workers nightly, and not just the ones that he went on to kill. Soon after killing Lorraine, he stuffed her body in an oil drum and dumped it about 40 miles away in a murky inlet at Coney Island, Brooklyn. Lorraine's bloated body would surface on July 11th, 1992, which was more than 6 months later. It was discovered by a local fisherman. Tragically, by that point, Lorraine's family still hadn't even reported her missing. And this was something that Joel found comforting about his victims, and likely why he chose them, right? For the most part, no one ever came looking for them. He later called it, and this is a quote, "a killer's dream come true." A world where his victims disappeared and no one even bothered to ask where they went or why. And with that nice sentiment, just 1 week later, Joel struck again and strangled yet another woman. This time it was 39-year-old Marianne Holloman, his oldest known victim. Pop quiz. What type of work did Marianne do by day? A, she peddled bootleg kung fu movies on the subway. B, she did psychic palm readings at a folding table in Brooklyn. C, she worked as a seamstress sewing personalized G-strings for exotic dancers. Go. The answer is C, which is kind of a fascinating, nifty job, I feel like. Also, I just said nifty. Apparently, I'm 90. She worked as a seamstress sewing personalized G-strings for exotic dancers at Goldfinger's, which was an upscale Manhattan strip club. Sadly, after Joel killed Marianne, he stuffed her body into an oil drum and dropped it into the Coney Island Creek, just like he had done with Lorraine 1 week earlier. The drum surfaced on July 9th, 1992, which was actually 2 days before Lorraine was found. And law enforcement was able to identify Marianne using her dental records. 2 women, same dump site, same disposal method, discovered less than 48 hours apart. In any functional investigative environment, that would have triggered an immediate red flag. Potential serial offender, possible linkage, time to mobilize. But apparently, when the victims are sex workers, urgency evaporates. But the pattern was right there. Still, no task force was launched, no alerts issued, and that vacuum of institutional indifference gave Joel Rifkin exactly what he needed: time, space, and the confirmation that no one was paying attention. By 1992, Rifkin entered what he chillingly referred to as his accelerated period, a spree marked not just by increased frequency, but by a noticeable decline in caution as well. His methods became messier, his dump sites more brazen, and why not, right? The lack of law enforcement pressure practically emboldened him. He wasn't evolving as a predator, he was devolving, growing careless, almost daring someone to stop him. But no one did. Forensic analysts would later note how minimal the concealment was. Bodies were wrapped haphazardly, left in shallow water or ditches just off major roadways. Some still had ligatures around their neck. He made no effort to alter his MO because he didn't need to. The risk calculus had shifted. He knew that if his victims were poor, addicted, and/or sex workers, they'd be deprioritized or dismissed altogether. And so, Joel the Ripper got lazy, as they do. Joel's 9th victim surfaced before his 7th or 8th, which is a dark irony that mirrored the disorder in his mind. Joel couldn't even recall her name, and just like with quote-unquote number 6, maybe never even knew it to begin with. What remained were scattered fragments, a few tattoos, a pickup somewhere in Manhattan, and the way she fought like hell when his hands closed around her throat. Unlike the other women, this woman, Joel's 9th victim, did not go quietly. She clawed at her attacker, kicked him. But in the end, sadly, it didn't matter because sometime during the frozen months of early 1992, Joel Rifkin killed her. Then he dismembered her and shoved her body parts into his last remaining oil drum. Then he rolled it into Newton Creek, which is a toxic ribbon of water snaking through Brooklyn, slick with industrial rot. And on May 13th, 1992, death surfaced in the form of a foot jutting up from the rusted drum, spotted just by chance. Toxicology revealed cocaine in this woman's system, and with that, police quickly moved on. And we're not surprised by this, right? At this point, she was buried without a name, without a story, just another anonymous victim, because she had cocaine in her system, so the police wrote her off as just a drug addict. It wasn't until Joel's confession in 1993 that anyone even realized this woman was missing and had been murdered. Even then, her true identity remained unknown, making her Joel's final Jane Doe. And to this day, she remains unidentified. By the end of 1992, Joel Rifkin claimed at least 7 lives. Then, on Mother's Day weekend, he picked up and murdered another woman, 25-year-old Iris Sanchez, and he killed her during sex. He squeezed her carotid artery, and according to Joel, Iris was dead within 10 seconds. Then he went to work a shift at the East Meadow liquor store with the sound of Iris's jewelry still clinking in his pocket. Iris's remains were found a year later beneath a rotting mattress at a filthy illegal dump site off Rockaway Boulevard near JFK Airport. He intentionally copied the Green River Killer by dumping a body near an airport, which is something I've mentioned a few times now, right? Like he was copying his idols. I want to pause here for a moment to explore Joel's true motivation, okay? Which we've obviously touched upon and spoken about, but like what was he really getting out of his abhorrent actions and how did he derive pleasure from them? This is, I think, fascinating. According to Dr. Park Elliott Dietz, who we've talked about before on Psychopedia, who is a total G, he spent 4 days interviewing Joel, and he maintains that Joel's primary focus was the act of killing itself, okay? So the strangulation, or as was the case with his first victim, bludgeoning. Thus, he was a process killer. Dr. Dietz is one of the most prominent and accomplished forensic psychiatrists in the world, and he's consulted or testified in many of the highest-profile U.S. criminal cases, including Betty Broderick, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Kaczynski, and the D.C. sniper attacks, and others. I'm just naming a few. So I'm not sitting here debating Dr. Dietz or anything, because who the fuck am I to do that? But in my view, it wasn't just about murdering itself. It was about the lead up for Joel Rifkin. The real power came from that amp up or that ramp up, right? From orchestrating the entire scenario. This is my opinion. This is like my musing. Rifkin derived control not simply from the act of killing, but from engineering the vulnerability, luring a woman into his car, stripping her of autonomy, placing her in a position where every ounce of agency was gone, and knowing that he alone would decide if she lived or died. That's where the domination began. That's where the pleasure lived. The murder was just the final punctuation mark on a sentence he'd been writing from the moment the woman got into his car. That said, Dr. Dietz has pointed out that Joel did not engage in prolonged torture or sadistic rituals prior to the kill. So I guess he would say the lead-up period, leading up to the kill wasn't what got Joel off. I don't know. I still think that there was this whole experience for him prior to the actual murder. But I do think that this distinction is important because it suggests that the murder itself, the precise moment of extinguishing life, was the pinnacle of gratification. The act wasn't preceded by extended torment, which is true, but rather by just enough calculated buildup in which control, vulnerability, and fatal finality were all tightly compressed into a single decisive act. So I just want to make this clear because I think maybe I wasn't so clear in presenting this. A process killer, which is what Dr. Dietz says Joel Rifkin is a killer who enjoys the actual process of killing. So if you're stabbing someone, it's the act of penetrating that knife through flesh. In this case, it's Joel Rifkin wrapping his hands around a woman's neck and strangling her until she dies. It's the process of extinguishing life. That's a process killer. And that's what Dietz is saying Joel is. I am, again, I'm not like a schmuck. I'm not like actually going against Dietz here, but I just think that it's more than the actual moment of taking a life for Joel Rifkin. I think it's the lead-up period. I think it's prowling the streets. I think it's, getting a woman into the car. Sometimes he would drive them around for hours and hours and hours to score drugs. I think that whole time was just part of the pleasure for him. I don't think it was just the act of killing. I really don't. I mean, that is the ultimate act of control, and he is somebody who feeds off control. So yes, I'm certainly not saying that like actually killing isn't like doing it for him. I just think it's more than that. So I just wanted to make that distinction. One thing seems to be indisputable here across the board, like in all the sources I've read, all the research I've done, and that is that Joel Rifkin exhibited clear traits of a sexual sadist. His fantasies were steeped in violence, humiliation, and control, and he repeatedly sought to actualize them, most notably during the act of strangulation where physical domination and psychological degradation converged. Many sources, including Dr. Dietz, also claim that Joel was a necrophiliac, citing instances where, on at least 4 occasions, Joel fondled, caressed, or groped his victims after they died. Dr. Dietz noted, quote, Mr. Rifkin talked of tenderly caressing his dead victims as if stroking and soothing a girlfriend. However, Mr. Rifkin said he did not have intercourse with any of the dead. He said it didn't feel right. End quote. Dietz also remarked on the pattern of how long Joel kept using each body, or holding on to each body. In one case, he kept one body for 4 days. However, that said, again, I'm sorry to go against Dr. Dietz, but despite all of Joel's eventual confessions, he remains adamant that he never engaged in necrophilia, right? So Dietz said, look, he never had sexual intercourse with a dead body, but he would like fondle them and keep the bodies around. Joel insists, always has and continues to insist that he would never, ever do anything sexually with a dead body. He only ever ejaculated during strangulation. But even then, he felt no elation, no rage, no intoxication, just an eerie sense of calm throughout the entire thing. Potentially, maybe, what Dietz is alluding to here is tactile necrophilia, which is people who are aroused by touching or stroking a corpse without engaging in actual intercourse. So fun fact there, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, defines 10 different classes of necrophilia based on increasing severity of the disorder. That said, Joel Rifkin denies being any type of necrophiliac. And I'm inclined to believe him because the motherfucker loves to give shock value. And he knows the creepier and shittier he is, the more attention he's going to get. I think he would have no problem talking about being a necrophiliac. He denies it. And honestly, I don't think he was. Okay, we're going to move on because I don't like going against Dr. Dietz. It doesn't feel good for me. I'm not happy about this. I just have to speak my truth. So anyway, with Joel, it was the sense of calm that drove him. A cold, emotionless tranquility that allowed him to carry out his horrific acts without hesitation or 1 ounce of remorse. Which is why I said earlier, if you recall, with the murder of Yoon Lee, when he said that she was the only victim that he killed where he felt remorse. And I'm like, nah, I'm calling bullshit, man. You didn't feel remorse. You're sad that you don't have her to, hire anymore. She's gone now. She was somebody you engaged with on more than one occasion for transactional sex, and she's gone. Maybe you regret that. You do not regret killing her. So anyway, let's pick back up now with the timeline, okay? Starting with Joel Rifkin's next known victim, 33-year-old Anna Lopez, murdered on May 25th, 1992. According to her mother, Anna was never quite the same after a suicide attempt at just 13 years old. She had swallowed a large dose of medication prescribed for tuberculosis exposure, and though she survived, her mother believed that the overdose caused lasting brain damage. And from that point on, Anna's life began to unravel. She slipped through the cracks entirely, falling into homelessness, battling addiction, and drifting further from the girl her family once knew. By the time Joel encountered her, Anna was profoundly vulnerable, living on the margins of society, isolated, struggling, and forgotten. She really became exactly the kind of target that he was looking for, a woman whose disappearance would barely register on the radar. And Joel exploited that with chilling precision. Weeks later, Joel picked up and murdered 21-year-old Violet O'Neill in Lower Manhattan. Her torso was eventually found wrapped in black plastic in the Hudson River, her arms and legs found in a suitcase. Next came Joel's 13th victim, 31-year-old Mary Catherine Williams. Mary Catherine had once been the homecoming queen and a cheerleader at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She moved to New York City chasing dreams of stardom, imagining glamorous film roles and bright city lights, hoping for a fresh start after a failed marriage. But instead, she found addiction and sex work. The city's promises had quickly evaporated, leaving only the raw will to survive. The red carpets that she'd once dreamed of were now replaced by cold pavement and long, lonely nights. Joel met Mary Catherine Williams before, twice, in fact, and unlike most of the women he encountered, with the exception of Yoon Lee, he felt something disturbingly close to affection for her, for lack of a better word, because I don't think he was capable of it, but something close to it. There was a gentleness to Mary Catherine, a warmth that sort of disarmed him. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, a kind of bruised but unwavering humanity that unsettled something deep within Joel, something he rarely, if ever, allowed himself to feel. But on October 2nd, 1992, that fleeting sense of connection meant nothing. As she sat beside him in the front seat of his mother's car, casually flipping through old photographs of her estranged husband, Joel reached for her throat and began to squeeze. But Mary Catherine was not ready to die. Midway through the assault, she jolted back into consciousness, adrenaline surging, survival instinct igniting like a live wire. She thrashed, clawed, kicked with everything she had. Her struggle was so fierce, so visceral, that she snapped the gear shift clean off the steering column, shattering any illusion that Joel might have had of having complete control. This wasn't one of his usual kills. Mary Catherine fought hard, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the predator lost his grip. Caught off guard and losing control, Joel went into a desperate frenzy. He smothered his opponent, held her down with both hands until her body finally went still. When Mary Catherine's body was ultimately discovered lying in the snow amidst a pile of branches, her jaw was hanging wide open, revealing that her last moment on earth had been spent screaming, which I hate so much. 23-year-old Jenny Soto was Joel's next victim and the final one of 1992. According to Joel, she was the quote-unquote toughest one to kill because she fought back aggressively, leaving deep, bleeding grooves in Joel's skin and breaking every one of her fake fingernails in the process. At the same time that she was breaking her fingernails, Joel was breaking Jenny's neck. Then he removed her panties, bra, gold drop earrings, ID card, and a syringe to hold onto as souvenirs. Jenny's body was dumped into the same spot as Yoon Lee's and later washed up along the rocks of the Harlem River in November of 1992. And even though two bodies were found in more or less the same area, again, law enforcement still did not consider the fact that they had a serial killer on their hands. Instead, after she'd been identified by her fingerprints, they attempted to pin Jenny's murder on her boyfriend, who at the time was an aspiring rapper named Popcorn. After Jenny's murder, Joel disappeared from the kill zone for 15 weeks, not out of remorse, but out of strategy. He licked his wounds, obsessed over his mistakes, and reworked every approach. His silence was everything but a retreat. It was a recalibration. And when Rifkin resurfaced in 1993, he was different, colder, crueler, and even more detached from that thin line between man and monster. A term that we will go on to discuss later on in this episode. So remember, the term monster. I've talked about it before, so you're probably not going to be shocked. But that year, though, he did claim his final 3 victims, each one bloodier, bolder, and more brutal than the last. 28-year-old Leah Evans, mother of 2, came next. Now, Leah wasn't a sex worker by trade. In fact, she was actually the daughter of a former Manhattan civil court judge and once attended Sarah Lawrence College. Sarah Lawrence College we covered a case that happened there, the Larry Ray cult case that happened at Sarah Lawrence College. If that sounded familiar, maybe that's why. However, after possibly being mugged or robbed that night, the night that Joel picked her up, Leah found herself in a desperate situation and agreed to have sex with him for money. Joel, unable to maintain an erection, shocking, likely because he didn't feel the same sense of superiority over her, strangled her to death. He then buried her in a shallow grave in Southampton, located in eastern Long Island. Several months later, her hand, still adorned with red nail polish, was discovered sticking out of the ground by people on a nature walk. Can you imagine seeing that? It's like zombie style, like a hand coming up from the dirt. It's so upsetting. And the fact that Joel buried her in a shallow grave in the first place points to his rising level of arrogance, because to do that, he had to have thought that there was no way anybody would find her, no way that he'd ever get caught. Look how many women he's killed so far and has gotten away with. Why bother with dismemberment anymore? Why bother with a trunk, an oil truck, Why? And to some extent, he was right, because Leah Evans wasn't even identified until after Joel was eventually caught. Next came 28-year-old Lauren Marquez, the second to last victim to be discovered. Originally from Tennessee, she came to New York City seeking a better life, but instead found herself consumed by addiction and poverty. To survive, she turned to sex work on 2nd Avenue. On the evening of April 2nd, 1993, Joel Rifkin picked her up without a word, no drugs exchanged, no promises made, no sex. The moment Lauren closed the car door, Joel lunged and snapped her neck. He then drove east to the remote Pine Barrens of Suffolk County, a perfect place to make her disappear. He dumped her quickly, no shallow grave this time, and Lauren's body was lost until August 20th, 1993, when DNA finally restored her name. But by then, Joel was already in custody. The autopsy revealed the rest of her story: fractured ribs and blunt force trauma. Joel later claimed to have no memory of inflicting those injuries, but her bones told the story, carved in silent testament to the violence she endured. And lastly, mercifully, was Tiffany Bresciani, Joel's final victim. She was just 22 years old and originally from Louisiana. She, like many, had dreams of becoming an actress, so she came to New York, chasing the promise of something bigger, but instead, again, same old story here, which is so sad, became addicted to cocaine. Tiffany started dancing in strip clubs, then performed in one of New York City's sex emporiums called the Big Top Lounge before moving to the streets, where she began trading her body for the drugs that were consuming her. But Joel had actually seen her perform at the Big Top Lounge and had become obsessed with her. So on a warm June morning in 1993, Joel picked Tiffany up where she was working on Allen Street, and that's in Manhattan. She was the second sex worker he had encountered that night, and the fourth in just 2 days. By this point, he was moving with detached efficiency, albeit with some technical issues, as once again, he was unable to get an erection. There was also another complication that Joel encountered. Pop quiz. What was the complication? A, his late father's favorite song started playing out of the car radio, causing an emotional lapse. B, a man doing Tai Chi suddenly appeared 3 feet from his car. C, Joel accidentally locked himself out of the car while Tiffany passed out from the drugs, leaving him with no access to her or his car. The answer is B. Incredibly, a man doing Tai Chi suddenly appeared 3 feet from his car as Tiffany, naked, lay freshly strangled in the backseat of his car. So he needed to move quickly and stealthily, which both angered and stressed him out. But he got the hell out of there and he began running some errands with a fresh corpse in his car. First, he stopped at one store to buy a tarp, then another for rope. When Joel finally returned to his mother's home in East Meadow, he wrapped Tiffany's body in the tarp and forced it into the trunk. Then, suddenly, his mother appeared asking for the car. He had his own car, which we're going to get to, but for all of these murders that we've been talking about hitherto, he was driving his mother's car, which was like a Toyota sedan or something like that. Joel simply handed over the keys to his mother's car and watched her pull away with Tiffany's decomposing body in her trunk. For half an hour or so, Joel's mother ran around town running errands, completely unaware that there was a body in the trunk. When she returned home, Joel removed Tiffany's body and placed it inside of a wheelbarrow in his garage. And for the next several days, he carried on as if nothing had happened. He spent his time in the garage working on his pickup truck, only feet away from where Tiffany's body was decomposing in a wheelbarrow out in the open. The heat grew stronger and the smell thickened. So what did he do? He simply smeared Noxzema beneath his nostrils to combat the odor. Now, Noxzema was really, really big in the 90s, so maybe some younger people may not know, but Noxzema, it's like a zit cream, basically. It smells really, really strong. So he was using that so that he could smell it, like kind of putting Vicks beneath your nose so that it just like covers whatever it is that you don't want to smell. Finally, on the morning of June 28th, 1993, Joel loaded Tiffany's body into his pickup truck, so now he's using his car, and finally set out to dispose of it just 15 miles away and headed towards the Republic Airport, which is located in Melville in Suffolk County. I get my nails done close to the Republic Airport, by the way, so I know it well. It was a familiar process for Joel by this point. He overlooked, however, a crucial detail, and that was that the vehicle he was transporting Tiffany's decomposing body in, his truck, did not have license plates. So here's the deal. Joel had 2 vehicles, but he only wanted to pay for one registration. So he'd regularly move the license plates from one vehicle to the other. And on this occasion, with a rotting corpse in his trunk, he simply forgot to do this. Because Joel was just getting sloppy. It was a simple yet critical mistake, like so many before him and so many after. And this was the straw or the mistake that broke the serial killer's back. Because serial killers, they be like that. Sloppy, arrogant, they start believing in their own invincibility, thinking they're too clever, too invincible, too ordinary to ever get caught. But that's the thing about compulsion. It doesn't just escalate the violence, it erodes the discipline. They cut corners, they take risks, and eventually they crack the door open just wide enough for someone, anyone, to see inside. A careless dump site, a receipt left behind, one misstep. It's all it takes. And once that door is open, even an inch, it doesn't close again. Because that's when the unraveling begins. That's when the house of horrors they built on secrecy, blood, and ego starts to collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. And in Joel Rifkin's case, the idiot was seen driving a vehicle without a rear license plate, causing state troopers Deborah Spargerin and Dean Ruin to pull him over on the Southern State Parkway. As Joel attempted to evade law enforcement by increasing his speed to 90 miles per hour and pulling off the highway with a corpse in his trunk, the troopers radioed for assistance, and within minutes, they were joined by several other state police units, as well as mobile units from the Nassau County Police Department. Joel lost control of his car and wound up hitting a wooden utility pole not far from a county courthouse. Police officers drew their firearms and ordered Joel out of his truck at gunpoint. At this point, Tiffany's dead body had not even yet been discovered. But then, just as one of the officers was removing an orange X-Acto knife from Joel's back pocket, a different officer popped the trunk. And the Ripper's jig was finally up. Now, Joel insists that getting caught was a relief. In fact, he slept for days in lockup after his arrest. Because deep down, Joel knew that he'd essentially never have to make another decision again in his life. Each time he killed or didn't was a monumental choice, and the weight of that never left him. Every action, every move had to be kept secret, and the constant effort to hide the truth was exhausting. With his capture, that burden lifted, and for the first time in years, he could just exist without the pressure of the next deadly decision hanging over him. And one thing I didn't mention is that right before he killed his final victim, Tiffany, he started experiencing premonitions about getting caught, which is just reflective that he was cracking, that he was starting to break down. I'm not going to say it was a result of guilt or remorse, paranoia maybe. Something psychologically was deteriorating in him such that he started having what he called premonitions. So I think that's what we're talking about here, right? Having the relief of not having to worry about getting caught anymore was like intoxicating for him. Even though he was essentially relieved to have been caught, at first he only admitted to killing Tiffany. But after just a few hours of interrogation, the floodgates opened, and Joel Rifkin spilled every gruesome detail of all 17 murders. Like many serial killers, he absolutely reveled in the attention, the spotlight, the power of being the one that everyone needed for answers. It was his moment to be in control, to be needed, wanted, and to hold all the cards while the world hung on his every word. Attention, which hitherto, nice, had always eluded him, was finally his for the taking. Joel's confessions were methodical, almost clinical. Names, dates, locations, methods, the works, except for, quote-unquote, number 6 and number 9, because he never knew their names. He handed over maps, he led investigators to buried remains, and he returned the trophies that he'd kept as souvenirs. He even identified victims that no one even realized had been missing. When asked why he had done it, his answers fluctuated with unsettling inconsistency. At times, it was about power. At others, loneliness, resentment, or boredom. There was never a singular motive, no moment of clarity or insight, just a series of shifting justifications that never fully explained the depth of his actions. He was taken to the Nassau County Correctional Facility and 17 days after that appeared in court with his feet shackled, where he pleaded not guilty to killing Tiffany Bresciani. Many of his victims' families packed the courtroom and created a really powerful and unyielding presence. Prosecutors also charged Joel Rifkin with 9 counts of murder despite his confession to 17. The problem was the remaining cases lacked physical evidence, fell into jurisdictional gaps, or simply failed to generate the momentum needed for further prosecution, so he couldn't be nabbed for all 17, even though he confessed. From the start, the outcome of the trial was never really in question. Though his defense team tried to argue that Joel was suffering from mental illness, psychiatric evaluations ultimately concluded that he was competent to stand trial. This meant that Joel Rifkin would be tried and ideally convicted for each murder where the evidence was strongest, one by one. Now, Joel had many different attorneys. He actually fired his first attorney, Robert Sale, who was incredibly good at his job and probably would have been Joel's best shot at any type of insanity defense. He then wound up hiring less competent legal representation and even felt that he could defend himself to a certain degree. He also truly believed that while he would likely be found guilty of killing Tiffany, that he would walk on all the other charges. And all of this, from firing a skilled attorney to essentially attempting to represent himself with his new lawyers, there basically just for show, who, by the way, he wound up firing and replacing, was a perfect display of Joel Rifkin's narcissistic tendencies. At this stage, he was absolutely loving all of the attention he was getting. The media was all over him, and finally, after a lifetime of being invisible, he was being seen. He soaked up every headline, every news segment, every whispered mention of his name like it was long overdue applause. For Joel Rifkin, infamy was better than anonymity, and now the whole world was watching. Until they weren't. because fate, with its twisted sense of irony, had other plans. Joel Rifkin, the man who spent his entire life being overlooked, who finally basked in the grotesque glory of media attention, was abruptly shoved off the front page because just days later, Colin Ferguson walked onto a Long Island Railroad train and opened fire, killing 6 and wounding 19. And the press, foaming at the mouth at the rarity of a public mass shooting back then, pivoted immediately. And Joel Rifkin's moment in the macabre spotlight was over. And just like that, he was replaced, forgotten. And for someone who killed to feel in control and seen, that erasure must have been the cruelest cut of all. Good. I hope it still fucking hurts. Okay, let's get to the trial, which didn't even have cameras rolling. That's how insignificant he had suddenly become. Joel's culpability was never in doubt, right? He confessed to Tiffany's murder along with the other 16, and all of his confessions were deemed admissible in court, even though not all of the victims could be highlighted in trial. He wasn't charged with all of their murders, even though he confessed. Everything he said was admissible. The real question, however, was whether or not Joel Rifkin was legally insane at the time he committed the crimes. In other words, the court needed to determine whether he was aware that he was doing something wrong, a crucial factor in establishing his mental state and the severity of his responsibility for the murders. According to a psychiatrist called by the defense, Dr. Barbara R. Kerwin, when she looked at Joel, she saw, quote, the same inhuman look in the eyes of a milk shark that she once rescued at a Long Island beach than she saw when she looked into Joel Rifkin's eyes. Detached, bored, disinterested, and proof of a predatory nature and a lack of remorse. After administering the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory Test, or the MMPI, to determine psychopathology, it was determined, according to Kerwin and one of her colleagues, that Joel Rifkin was a near-classic psychotic. Kerwin's colleague indicated that he'd never seen elevations like that before on that test, and that they were, quote-unquote, off the scale. Kerwin also said that they were the most pathological test results she'd ever encountered in 20 years of administering the test in parole offices, prisons, and the back wards of mental hospitals. She explained that Joel suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and was delusional, grandiose, hallucinatory, and incoherent. She said his mind was like a videotape in that it could be fast-forwarded and then suddenly rewound out of nowhere. In other words, there was no normal time sequencing in his thinking. However, the prosecution countered with the findings of Dr. Dietz, mentioned earlier, whose findings could not have differed anymore. In fact, much of the trial was essentially this heated pissing match between Dietz and Kerwin. So we already established that Dietz saw Joel as a sexual sadist, a necrophiliac, and as someone who suffered from mood swings and personality disorders. Dietz firmly maintained that Joel did not have a thinking disorder and that when he discussed hearing whispers in his mind, which Kerwin used as proof that he was hallucinating, that was not Joel hearing voices. Rather, it was his own internal voice, which Joel recognized as such. Meaning, Joel was fully aware of his actions, he knew what he was doing and why he was doing it. There was no external force compelling him, no delusion clouding his judgment. It was simply a man in full possession of his faculties choosing to commit heinous acts. And lastly, in terms of the MMPI, the test that Kerwin used, Dr. Dietz maintained that Joel intentionally manipulated the test results. But here's the main thing in terms of where the battle of the psychiatrists differed. According to Dr. Dietz, Joel Rifkin was not insane and, crucially, knew exactly what he was doing when he was doing it. He knew it was wrong, and he continued to do it anyway. He pointed to the fact that Joel went to great lengths to hide the bodies, maintained the mother of all lies for 4 years, and took cops on a high-speed chase with a corpse in his trunk. Serial killers, pedophiles, murderers may be cold, they may be calculated, and they may be remorseless, but in most cases, they are unquestionably sane. What I'm about to read to you is one of my all-time favorite things that I've come across in all of my research and criminology studies. So, I know it's a bold statement, but listen to this. Dietz offers the parallel of villagers centuries ago who find a horribly mutilated corpse with human tracks in the snow around it. He says, quote, "Do they conclude a man did this? No, it had to be a man-beast, hence the vampire, hence the werewolf. Other times and places, would a man do this? No, only a witch, only Satan. In our time, would a man do this? No, only an insane person would do this. If it looks too much like us, it's intolerable." And this is sort of the point I'm always trying to make when we talk about horrific human beings and why I personally am not a fan of referring to them as monsters. That's exactly it. Because calling them monsters lets us distance ourselves from the truth, and it gives us the comfort of thinking that there's something other, right? Something we can't possibly relate to or ever understand. But the truth is, these fucking assholes are just human. They're humans who chose to do monstrous things, and when we strip away the supernatural labels, we are left with the uncomfortable reality that real-life killers look just like us. So we need to stay vigilant. We need to keep our eyes open. We need to look for signs and red flags, address mental health issues before they spiral out of control, and protect children from the toxic environments that breed abuse and trauma. It's not about waiting for someone to turn into a monster. It's about recognizing the warning signs before someone crosses that line. And the more we understand, the better we can prevent. So sort of putting this barrier between us and quote unquote them, I think gets in the way of us really figuring out how this happens and how we can prevent it from happening. I was excited to read that to you guys. Now, more on that topic, Dietz has spoken about 2 successive classes that he's taught in Virginia in which his students observed interviews with 2 killers, one who had murdered his mother with a hatchet and who laughed throughout the entire interview. He kept staring at the ceiling and rubbing his crotch. He was clearly crazy, and the students seemed jovial and unconcerned after the interview. They went about their life. The second session, though, was with a man who had raped, sodomized, and strangled a girl, left her body with a stick still jammed inside of her vagina. This killer seemed rational and composed. He was around the students' age, and he dressed like them, he looked like them. And the students emerged from that interview, Dietz says, badly shaken. And then Dietz says on that note, quote, "If it looks too much like us, it's intolerable." And I get it. It's unsettling to imagine that these heinous killers are made of the same raw human material as the rest of us, that beneath the bloodshed and depravity, they're not monsters from another world. They're just twisted reflections of what any of us could become under the right or wrong conditions. And that's what makes them so dangerous. Evil that looks like a monster is easy to run from. Evil that smiles, holds a job, and says all the right things, that's the kind that slips through the cracks and takes innocent lives down with it. Anyway, Dietz believes that many serial killers, though genuinely disordered, are in fact in control of themselves when they kill and are thus legally responsible. In other words, they're not psychotic. They are like every other criminal, he says. What makes people willing to commit offenses for sexual arousal is exactly the same thing that makes people who want more money willing to commit robbery. And that was a quote from Dietz. They rationalize their crimes, he says, or feel entitled to destroy others for their personal gain. Lastly, Dietz told the jury, quote, "He is sick, but he is not insane." The trial lasted 3 weeks, and on May 9th, 1994, after only 2.5 hours of deliberations, the jury found Joel Rifkin guilty of murder, as well as a felony count of reckless endangerment for leading police on the high-speed chase. Pop quiz in the form of a true or false question. True or false? A longer jury deliberation period typically means that the verdict will favor the defendant. True or false? Go. The answer is true. Obviously, this is not always the case, but typically, if the jury is deadlocked on a verdict, which leads to a longer deliberation period, it could lead to a hung jury, which is generally beneficial for the defendant as it prevents a conviction. I just thought that was interesting. Joel received his first sentence, which was 25 years to life for the murder of Tiffany Bresciani. Over the months that followed, he pleaded guilty to the murders of Mary Catherine Williams, Iris Sanchez, and Lauren Marquez. Each guilty plea added another 25 years to life. The sentences continued to accumulate until they formed a legal wall he would never be able to climb. In total, Judge Robert Hannafy sentenced Joel Rifkin to 203 years to life in prison. The Ripper would never walk free. At his sentencing hearing, Judge Hannafy stated, quote, "It is not in my power to give Mr. Rifkin the sentence he deserves. In case there is such a thing as reincarnation, I want you to spend your second life in prison." Mic drop. Years later, in 2000, Joel actually filed a lawsuit against the state of New York, claiming that his long-term solitary confinement violated his constitutional rights because he was confined to his cell at the Attica Correctional Facility for 23 hours a day for over 4 years. Why? Because he was being relentlessly bullied by the other inmates who threw cups of urine and feces at him all day long. Seems like bullied in childhood, bullied once again. Side note, at the same prison, at the same time, was David Berkowitz, son of Sam. Anyway, a state appellate court ruled that prison officials had not infringed upon Joel's rights by keeping him in isolation. Joel Rifkin is now known as inmate number 93A4053 and continues to serve a life sentence at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. Though technically eligible for parole, that possibility won't arrive until the year 2197, centuries after his arrest. So, was Joel Rifkin a mission-oriented killer? Did he target sex workers with the intent to cleanse society? I don't think so, and neither does he. According to Joel, he didn't harbor any deep-rooted hatred for women or sex workers specifically. Instead, he was driven by an overwhelming, degrading need for their sexual services. In his mind, the only way to rid himself of this crippling dependency, this addiction to transactional sex, was to kill them. For him, their deaths weren't about punishing them. They were about severing his connection to that addiction in the most twisted way possible. But Joel has always insisted that the reason behind his killing is, to him, unclear. Yes, he craved power, but in terms of him being a mission-oriented killer, it wasn't about saving the world or righting any perceived wrongs. There was no grand ideology driving him, just a twisted need to assert his power over others, to reduce them to nothing more than objects he could manipulate and discard at his will. Let's talk now, this is interesting, about the psychological process of a serial killer. First identified by psychologist Joel Norris in 1988, there's a series of phases or a psychological process that a serial killer goes through before, during, and after the killings. Through extensive interviews with numerous serial killers, Norris has identified 7 distinct phases in the killer's psychological evolution. The first phase is the aura phase, in which there is a withdrawal from reality. So the killer begins to experience shifts in personality, a decline in social interactions, and, just to put it simply, starts to transform into a vessel for their fantasies. The second phase is the trolling phase, where the killer actively seeks out a victim who fits the specific needs of their fantasies. This phase is marked by intense focus and/or stalking and/or scouting, with the killer becoming almost singularly obsessed with finding the right target. The third phase is the wooing phase, and this is when most killers win the confidence of victims before luring them into a death trap. This is a very important phase, and a killer who cannot gain the trust of the intended victim may very well move on to another one. Phase number 4, the capture phase. This is considered one of the defining moments by the killer. It is during this phase that the killer lets his true intentions begin to shine through, a proverbial Jekyll and Hyde transformation. Phase number 5, the totem phase. This is when the killer holds on to a personal item of the victim as a trophy or a souvenir, right? We talked about that. Joel Rifkin absolutely did that. And the last phase, the 6th phase, is the depression phase. And this is when the victim, now killed, no longer represents what the killer thought he or she represented. When the killer's fantasy remains unfulfilled, he will eventually revert to the belief that committing murder once more will satisfy his desires, and thus he will return to the first phase, the aura phase, once again. Honestly, Joel Rifkin completely matches this psychological profile with all 17 of his victims. To this day, Joel Rifkin's name casts a heavy shadow over Long Island. To many, it is less a name than a ghost a symbol of the lives he stole and the silence that allowed him to operate in plain sight in the first place. He murdered 17 women, each with a name, a history, and some with families who never stopped looking. Yet for years, sadly, most of their deaths went unnoticed, slipping quietly into the margins until Joel's arrest would force the world to remember. Even now, questions linger. Some investigators believe the true number of his victims may be higher than 17. Gaps in his timeline suggest there could be more unclaimed bodies or unsolved cases that never even made the news. In one interview, Rifkin told a psychiatrist that he often fantasized about killing a woman every 2 weeks. So if those fantasies were acted upon consistently, the math would suggest that 17 is a very conservative estimate. Joel Rifkin was nothing if not ordinary, unremarkable, underwhelming, the human equivalent of beige wallpaper. He was just ordinary everywhere, ordinary looking, ordinary feeling, and aside from being a serial killer, he behaved just like any other ordinary, forgettable schlock. But when it came to murder, that's when he felt extraordinary. And that desire to feel extraordinary, to feel powerful, to feel seen, is not some alien impulse. It's deeply, painfully, relatably human. Joel Rifkin, as monstrous and unforgivable as his crimes were, wasn't born from the darkness or stitched together from evil DNA in some lab. He was made of the same fragile, fallible stuff as the rest of us. No horns, no fangs, no supernatural curse, just a broken boy who became a dangerous man, shaped by years of humiliation, isolation, unchecked compulsions, and perhaps brain damage, which we talked about in part 1. If we want to prevent future Joel Rifkins, we have to look closer sooner, not with fear, but with awareness, because prevention doesn't start in the courtroom. It starts in classrooms, in homes, in mental health clinics, in every quiet moment where someone is slipping through the cracks, unnoticed and unheard. And if we don't listen then, we just may indeed be forced to reckon later. And that concludes our 2-part coverage of serial killer Joel Rifkin, aka Joel the Ripper. One of the sources that I used for this case is a book called From the Mouth of the Monster. Ironic, since I just spent 2 hours telling you why we shouldn't call them monsters. The Joel Rifkin story, and the author is Robert Mladenich. Robert actually went to high school and then college, I believe, or just college. He went to school with Joel Rifkin, which is why Joel Rifkin allowed him initially to come in and to interview him. And so a lot of the book contains like firsthand statements and quotes and what have you from Joel Rifkin. But it's an interesting perspective because it's coming from somebody who knew Joel before he became a serial killer. So yeah, I would recommend the book. Also, I meant to mention this earlier. Season 5, episode 9 of Seinfeld, the episode called The Masseuse, actually references Joel Rifkin. So Elaine was dating a masseuse whose name was Joel Rifkin. And she was like, yeah, you guys change your name. Like, I can't date somebody with the name of a serial killer. So she's going through like books and magazines and shit, like trying to find a different name that she can give her boyfriend. So she goes, how about OJ? And this was 7 months before everything happened with OJ. So how funny is that? How ironic is that? It's like so perfect. But yeah, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this 2-part coverage and found it as interesting as I did. And even though I didn't know too much about Joel Rifkin before I started, I certainly know a lot about him now. And I'm rethinking what I mentioned during the intro to this case, which is trying to get upstate to interview him in person. I just don't want to give him that satisfaction. I'd be fascinated to be in a room with him and to ask him all the questions that I have and to really get in the weeds. But I feel like he would just love it too much. And I can't do that to the victims. And I don't know. But anyway, let me know if you guys think I should interview him. I'd be interested to know what you guys think. Leave a comment, let me know. And I'd like to leave you off on a little palate cleanser because this 2-parter was heavy. Obviously, this palate cleanser is going to come in the form of a majestic, perfect creature with 4 paws, a tail, a beak, whiskers, and Oreo cookie coloring. And he also comes with the name Cash. So I will tell you, as I mentioned earlier, that I was sick, right? Since Sunday, like literally very, very sick. I don't want to remind you because I feel like it was too gross to even mention to begin with, so I'm not going to do it again. Guess who did not leave my side once? Cash Slater. If I tell you that firefighter Dave had to be like, bro, you have to go outside and pee, or I made you dinner, and this dog is food motivated typically, he would not leave me. And then one time when I came out of like a particularly like violent session, I came out and he was sitting like a soldier sitting outside the door. I swear to you, he was protecting me in the way that he could. He just did not leave my side once. So I'm going to leave you off on that. I also want to remind you to subscribe to the Psychopedia feed wherever you listen to your podcasts, not only for fresh, hot-ass content from Psychopedia, but also because July 28th, Girl on Gore, my new podcast, is dropping. And I don't want you guys to miss extra content. I'm going to be releasing bonus episodes coming up. Please subscribe, like, do your part, and leave a heart if you would be so kind. And yeah, that's all I got for today. Thank you guys so much, as always, for being here with me. Your support, your love, it really keeps me going, and it is completely appreciated on every level. So thank you from the bottom of my black heart. I love you all so much, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening. Bye.